Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis 14b of Maseches Kiddushin. We are just a couple lines from the bottom of the page. We are 4 lines from the bottom of the page. So the Gemara brought a brisa. The reason why the Gemara brought this brisa in, which is going to actually come up again later, is it was originally looking for an opinion that doesn't learn out the Gezerah Shava, the comparison of Sachir. That it says the word Sachir, which means like a worker, in the context of a Jewish slave who sells himself, and it says it in the context of a Jewish slave that Beis Din sells. And Sachir, it says it both. We learn to compare the relevant halachos, the relevant laws, one to the other. So the brisa brought 4 distinctions between these two things, between the slave who sells himself, the Jewish slave who sells himself, and the Jewish slave who is sold by Beis Din. According to the Tanna Kama, the first opinion of the brisa, there's 4 differences, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, who was the second opinion, or Rabbi Elazar, they're all the same. So the Gemara at first said, maybe the Tanna Kama, the first opinion, doesn't compare them. That's why you have these distinctions. And maybe Rabbi Elazar does compare them, does learn Sachir, and that's why he holds that they're always similar. They always have the same halachos. The Gemara ended up saying, no. Everybody holds of Sachir. Even the Tanna Kama, even the one who has the differences, still says, actually, we do compare them. Saying, why are there differences? Because each of those differences, each of those distinctions, there's a direct reason, an inference from a verse that you should differentiate. So the Gemara started going through those differentiations and why the Tanna Kama differentiates and why Rabbi Elazar doesn't. So the first one, which we learned last week, was the idea that the Tanna Kama had said that when someone sells himself, he can sell himself for 6 years or more. He's not limited to 6 years, while when Beis Din sells him, he's limited to just 6 years. He goes free after 6 years. That was the first, under normal circumstances. That was the first difference. That was according to the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama, the first opinion, explained why he held that, why we don't compare them in that instance. And Rabbi Elazar disagreed with all his proofs, all his sources, and Rabbi Elazar held, no, we still compare them, we still make the Gezerah Shava and say that just like when Beis Din sells him, he's limited to 6 years, so too, when he sells himself, he's limited to 6 years. That was the first thing. Now we pick up again 4 lines from the bottom, which is the second thing, and the second disagreement here. It asks, "My taima de Tanna Kama," what is the reason of the Tanna Kama, of the first opinion, de Amar, who said, "Mocher atzmo eino nirtza," that one who sells himself cannot be nirtza, cannot get his ear pierced to stay on for longer than 6 years. The Torah discusses this idea that if after 6 years the Jewish slave, he says, "Oh, I love my master, I love my wife that he set me up with, I want to stay on," so there's a process where they bore a hole in his ear, and he stays on longer until the Yovel. So the Tanna Kama held that that's only true when Beis Din sells him. Then he could do this. But when he sells himself, after 6 years, or whatever amount that he sold himself for, I guess, according to the Tanna Kama, he goes out. But there's no idea of extending his stay by having his ear pierced. So what's the source? Why not? What about the Gezerah Shava? If the Tanna Kama holds Sachir, and that you compare the two, so why don't we say it's the same here? So he says, there's a specific inference here. Exclusion. Midemiyet rachmana gabe machruhu Beis Din, because when it comes to where Beis Din sells him, it excludes this case. Because there it says, there is where we have this concept of boring hole, in the situation where Beis Din sells him, and there the verse says, V'ratza Adonai v'esazno b'martzeya, that the master will pierce his ear with a peg, and it says, the way it says it is, or I guess that really the way Rashi explains it is the whole verse is extra. It told us this in another place. It told us about this process in another pasuk somewhere. So therefore this verse is extra. So what's it saying? it says, and you should pierce his ear, and that's extra. It already said it somewhere else. So it's teaching me Azno Shalo, his ear, Vilo Azno Shal Mocher Atzmo, but not the ear of someone who sells himself. It's specifically in the case where based in sells him that we have the concept of piercing the ear and extending his term as a Jewish slave, but when he sells himself, there's no concept, he can't do that. That was why the Tanna Kama held that there's a difference here, because there's an exclusion. We exclude the case where he sells himself. Top of the next page, we now have the response. What does Rabbi Lazar respond to that? The Idach, the other opinion, will say, Hahi l'gzeira shavahu da'asa. No, that's not extra when it says azno. When it says the extra, this extra word, his ear, it's not coming to say his ear and not in the case where he sells himself. It's coming for something else. We need it. It's not extra because we need it for something else, which is a gzeira shava, another comparison that we make. Hu da'asa, that's what it's coming for. D'tanya, like we learned in a brisa. The brisa says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Minayin l'ritzia shehi ba'ozen yemanis. How do we know that the ear that we pierce is the right ear? Because it doesn't actually say which ear. It just says his ear. It doesn't say which ear. So the brisa explains, because nemar kan ozen. Because here it says the ear. V'nemar lehalan ozen. And the later also says the ear. What's later? Where else does it talk about an ear? So by the purification of a mitzora, of someone who had saras, so the part of the process is that he gets oil put on his ear. And which ear? So it's explicit there. It says yemanis, the right ear. So we know that when it comes to the purification of a mitzora, it's the right ear that's being used. So we now have a gzeira shava. It uses the word ozen here, and it uses the word ozen there. Now, I think I've mentioned in the past, a gzeira shava has to have a tradition from Sinai. You can't just say, it says vayedaber here, and it says vayedaber over here. It says, kesef here, it says kesef there, mani, right? There has to be a tradition. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying there's a tradition to learn that the word ozen by the piercing of the Jewish slave's ear is to be compared to the ozen, the ear, by the purification of a mitzora, of someone who had saras, and therefore that the brisa teaches malahalan yamin, just like in the case of the purification of the mitzora, it is the right ear. Afkan yamin, so too here it's the right ear. So that word azno is not extra. You can't use the word azno to teach me his ear is pierced, meaning when he's sold by Beis Din, by the court, but not when he sells himself. Because the word ozen there, that extra word, is being used for something else. It's being used for the gzeira shava, to compare it to the purification of the mitzora, and to teach me that it's the right ear. So how does the Tanna Kama respond to that? Ve'idach, they'll respond, imkein lemakra ozen. It's true, but it would have been fine to say just the word ozen, my azno. It could just say ear. Why does it say his ear? It's coming to teach me both things. So because it says his ear, so I can double dip. I can say that I have the gzeira shava, because for the gzeira shava it would have sufficed to just say ear without saying his ear. So I can learn that it's the right ear from using that gzeira shava, that comparison. But I can also infer his ear. In this case, we can pierce his ear, but not in the case where he sells himself. V'idach, and why does Rabbi Lazar respond to that? He says, we already need the extra azno, hahumi bayile, azno velo azna. No, we need azno, his ear, to teach me that we pierce his ear, but not her ear. Meaning the concept of extending the term of a Jewish slave only exists for a male, azno, his, but not hers. So an Alma Ivriya, a Jewish maidservant, cannot decide to stay on longer, cannot ask to stay on longer. She goes free once her term is up, and there's no concept of piercing her ear. Azno velo azna, ve'idach, and how does the Tanna Kama, who's using the word azno to exclude someone who sells himself, how do we exclude her? Where do we get that it's only his ear and not her ear? So he has a different pasuk. He says, Nafkala me ve'im yomar ha'eved. because the verse that speaks about when the slave asks to stay on, it says, V'im amar yomar ha'eved, if the male slave will say, Ahavti es Adoni, I love my master, etc., then he gets his ear pierced. So, but the way that it says it is, Im amar yomar ha'eved, and it talks about a male slave. Ha'eved v'lo ama, the male slave does that, but not the female slave. So there's no concept of, by the maidservant, of extending her term. V'idach, and the other side, why doesn't he learn that from there? Why doesn't Rebbe Lazar learn to exclude women that a Jewish a maidservant can't get her ear pierced to extend her term? Why doesn't he want to learn from the verse V'im Amar Yomar Ha'eved, where it says the slave, and not, we could say, not the female slave, not the maidservant? So mibayile, he needs that verse for something else. Ad sheyomar kishu eved. You know what you learn from the verse that says v'yomar yomar ha'eved? That if the slave will say, it teaches me that he has to say it while he's still a slave. But once he's free, he can't then say, actually, I would really like to stay on and get my ear pierced. It's only while he's still a slave. That's what it teaches me. Amar yomar ha'eved, the slave, but not when he's not a slave. So he can't use that to teach me that it's a male and not a female, and therefore he needs to learn that from Azno, his ear and not her ear, and that's why Rebbe Lazar won't use Azno to learn that it's by a slave who sells himself, but not a slave, it's by a slave that Beis Din sells, that can get his ear pierced, but not a slave that sells himself. But the Tanna Kama still has that pasuk available to teach that. V'idach, what does the Tanna Kama say? How does he know? How does he know if he's using the word imamor yomar ha'eved? If the Tanna Kama, if the first opinion is using that to say the male slave but not the female slave, so how does he learn that he can only demand to stay or ask to stay while he's still an eved, while he's still a slave and not afterwards? So he learns it me'eved ha'eved nafka. Because you could really learn both from that, he says, because it says, Im amor yomar ha-eved, the slave. It could have said, Im amor yomar eved, if a slave will say, I guess, but it says ha-eved, the slave, it's extra, and therefore we can learn two things. We can learn that he has to ask for it while he's a slave, and we can also learn that a male slave can do it, but not a female slave. Ve'idach, and what is Rebbe Lazar? Why doesn't he learn from there? Eved ha'eved lo darish. He just doesn't hold of that. He doesn't hold that that's considered extra. He doesn't think he can learn two things from the fact that it said ha'eved, the slave. So at the end of the day here, the reason why the Tanna Kama learns, even though he holds of the Gezeira Shava of Sachir, even though in general we learn the halachos that apply by a slave who sells himself to a slave who Beis Din sells, and vice versa, that when the halachos of when a slave, when Beis Din sells him, to the halachos of when he sells himself, but yet there's an exclusion. So even though when Beis Din sells him, he could get his ear pierced to stay on, but since it says azno, his ear, so we say his ear and not the ear of a slave who sells himself, and he's excluded. And Rebbe Lazar says, no, that's teaching me something else. You don't learn that out from there, and therefore we do compare them. Okay. My time of the Tanna Kama, now we're moving on to the next step of the Brisa. What is the reasoning of the Tanna Kama held? De Amar Mocher Atzmo Ein Manikin Lo. The Tanna Kama held that only when a slave is sold by Beis Din, when he goes free, there's a halacha ha'nek taniko. You have to give him gifts, you have to give him severance, but it's only when Beis Din sells him. But when he sells himself, then he doesn't get anything when he goes out. That's the opinion of the Tanna Kama, and the opinion of Rebbe Lazar was no, either way, we compare them, and he gets those gifts, he gets that severance, whether he was sold by Beis Din or whether he sold himself. So what is the reason? Why does the Tanna Kama, why does the first opinion say that they're different? I thought we're supposed to compare them using the Gezeira Shava of Sachir. So he says, Mi'et Rachmana Gayim Achruhu Beis Din, because there was an exclusion when it talked about this idea of giving the severance, so which was mentioned in the context of when Beis Din sells him. So over there, there's an exclusion. It says Hanek Taniku Lo. you should surely lading him with gifts, with severance. Lo v'lo l'mocher atzmo. Him, this guy, who based in sold, but not, we exclude, lo v'lo l'mocher atzmo. Him, but not if he sold himself. Only in this case, we're based in sold him. V'idach. What does Rebbe Elazar respond to that? Rebbe Elazar says, no, even in this case. So why does he respond to that inference? Hahumi bayile, he says, we need that word lo, him, for something else. Lo v'lo liyarshav. That this idea of hanik tanik lo, of giving him severance, is lo, we give him, but not to his inheritors. So if he dies, we don't pay the presents, the severance to the yarshim, to the heirs, only to him. That's what lo is teaching me. It's not coming to exclude a different case of where he sells himself. That's compared. There also he would get gifts, Rebbe Elazar will say. Lo is coming to exclude, we give him gifts, but not his heirs if he dies. So you don't owe anything, basically. There's no, if he died and you never gave him it yet, then you would not have to give it to his heirs. Asks the Gemara, what do you mean? Yarshav amai lo. Why not? Why will you not have to pay the heirs? Sachir karyer ethmana. The Torah refers to him as a worker. Ma sachir pulaso liyarshav. Just like a regular worker, if you didn't pay him yet and he died, so you have to pay you owe him the wages. You have to pay them to his heirs. So afhai pulaso liyarshav. So to here, this severance is actually more than it's actually considered like wages. And says the Gemara, you owe it to him, and you should have to pay it to the descendants, to the heirs. It doesn't make sense. Why would we exclude the heirs from this severance pay? So rather that can't be what it's coming to exclude. So why does Rebbe Elazar say it's coming to exclude? It has to be something else. Lo v'lo lebal chovo. That you pay it to him, but you don't have to pay it to his creditor. So you pay it to heirs, but you wouldn't have to pay it to a creditor. Now, why would you think that you have to pay it to a creditor? What does the creditor have to do with me? I owe this guy wages. It's not like there was a lien on them or anything that I would owe to the creditor. Why would I have to pay the wages to the creditor? So the Gemara says, because of the halacha of Rabbi Nassan. That's why you might think. Because midasvir alan ba'almak Rabbi Nassan, since we normally hold like Rabbi Nassan. What does Rabbi Nassan hold? Kidetanya, we're learning a brisa. Amar Rabbi Nassan said, Minayin lenoshe b'chavero manet, v'chavero b'chavero b'chavero. How do I know that if somebody owes his friend, and that friend owes another friend? So Reuven owes Shimon, and Shimon owes Levi. So minayin shemotziyim mizeh v'nostin lezeh. How do we know that Beis Din can actually be motzi, can take from Reuven and give it directly to Levi, to the third person? Again, Reuven owes Shimon, but Shimon owes Levi. How do we know that Beis Din can actually take from Reuven and give it directly to Levi? So Talmud Omar, that's why the pasuk says, the Torah teaches us, v'nasan la'asher asham lo. The pasuk here, it speaks about, I think, someone who denied owing something, and then he ended up having to pay it, and it says, v'nasan la'asher asham lo. And he should give it to the one that asham lo. Now, I think the simple reading of asham lo is the one that he wronged. But the Gemara learns out, Rabbi Nassim learns out, that asham in certain instances means like keren, means principal. He should give it to the one who the principal belongs to. And what does that mean? What that means is, it doesn't say you should give it to the one that you borrowed from. It says you should give it to whoever owns the principal. And in this case, the third party really has the rights to the principal. So says Rabbi Nassan, that teaches me that in a normal case, if Reuven owes Shimon and Shimon owes Levi, Beis Din can collect from Reuven to give directly to Levi. Now, what the pasuk is coming to teach me is that's true in a normal situation, but in this case of the Eved Ivri and the severance pay, we don't say that. Asa lo la fuke. That's what the word lo is coming to exclude. That we don't say that here. You might have thought that when the slave goes free, that Beis Din will say, okay, you owe him wages, you owe him this hanaka, this severance, and he owes his balchov, he owes his creditor. So we should just take it directly from the master and give it right to the creditor. That's what lo is coming, hanek tanik lo, you give it to him, but you don't give it to someone else, you don't give it to the creditor. Here it's excluded from that halacha. Ve'idach, and what will the other opinion say? Why don't we learn lo to teach me that? Meaning the Tanakama. The first opinion said lo is coming to teach me hanek tanik lo. You give presents, you give severance to him, meaning when Beis Din sells him, but not when he sells himself. So, but what about what Rebbe Lazar is suggesting that we use it to teach us? To teach us that you don't give it to the creditor. Why doesn't he want to learn that? So he says, because Ba'al Manami lo sfir lam Rabbi Nassan. In general, the Tanakh holds we don't hold like Rabbi Nassan at all. So we don't need to come to exclude that. He holds that we never take directly from the first guy and give it to the third guy. We don't never take from Reuben to give to Levi. So therefore, we don't need a special pasuk to also exclude it over here. That's generally not the halacha. So therefore, according to the Tanakama, the word lo is coming to exclude the situation of where he sells himself. That only when Beis Din sells him is there severance, but when he goes out, but not when he sells himself. And Rebbe Lazar is using lo to teach me something else. It's teaching me that in this case, we don't take from the master and give it directly to a creditor. Okay, now the fourth thing from the Brisa was the question of whether the master can marry a shifcha Canaanist, a Canaanite slave, to the Jewish slave. So the Tanakama said, the first opinion was that's only if Beis Din sells him, but not if he sells himself. And Rebbe Lazar said, no, even if he sells himself, the master can marry a shifcha Canaanist. The master can marry him to a Canaanite slave. So the Gemara asks, "My taima de Tanakama, Amar mocher atzmo ein rabbo moser lo shifcha Canaanist." What's the reason of the Tanakama of the first opinion who held that when he sells himself, his master may not marry him off to a shifcha Canaanist, to a Canaanite slave, even though he generally, again, has the gzeir shava of sacher, and does generally compare when he sells himself to when Beis Din sells him. So why here do we not compare that? Why here is he not allowed to be married to a Canaanite slave? Because mi'et rachmana gabe machruhu Beis Din. Because again, we say that it was excluded when it talked about it when in the situation of when Beis Din sells him. Because over there it says, im adonav yiten lo isha, if his master will give him a wife, etc., etc. But it says, will give him a wife, lo v'lo l'mocher atzmo. If his master will give him a wife, in this case that exists. In this case, where Beis Din sold him, that's where you have this concept, but, says the Tanakama, but not in the case where he sells himself. Ve'idach. So why does Rebbe Lazar respond to that? He says we do learn one from the other. So he says, lo bal karcho. The word lo is teaching me that we could do it even against his will. If Beis Din imadav yiten lo isha, if his master gives him a wife, then the extra word lo is teaching me even against his will. Ve'idach. So what does the Tanakama respond to that? How does the Tanakama, the first opinion, know that the master can give him a wife even against his will? Because from the following, it says, Miki mishneh sar sachir nafka. He learns it from the pasuk that says that the double the work of a worker did he give you. So this was the verse that was appeasing the master upon letting his slave go and saying, he gave you double work. So the Brisa says, the Tanya, we learn in a Brisa, ki mishnes sachar sachir avadcha, he served you double work for 6 years. So in what way was it double? So the Brisa suggests, maybe it's the following, sachir eino oved ala b'yom. A worker only works during the daytime. That's what a day worker, a day laborer. A regular worker only works during the daytime. Eved ivri oved bein bayom uvein balayla. But in Eved ivri, a Jewish slave, he works for you both day and night. So that's how the Brisa is interpreting the pasuk, the verse that says that he worked double, because regularly a worker only works during the day. He worked day and night. Asks the Gemara, this is really part of the Brisa, I think. The Brisa continues and it says, will you even imagine that you can make the Jewish slave work day and night? We treat him very fairly. The pasuk says, Ki tov lo imach, that it will be good with you. And we learn from there, imach b'machal, that he has to be equal to you in what he eats. Imach b'mishta, equal to you in what he drinks. And the Torah has a very high demand for how we have to treat this Jewish slave. And you have to make sure he has as good of a pillow as you and everything. You have to make sure he's taken care of really well. So says the Brisa. So will you possibly even entertain that you're allowed to work him day and night? Of course not. We treat him very nicely. So what does the Brisa mean? And what does the pasuk mean when it says you worked him double? The Brisa says you worked him day and night. What does that mean? So Rabbi Yitzchak said, Mikan, actually this may be interpretation of the Brisa. I don't think this is the Brisa anymore. This is the interpretation of the Brisa. Mikan, from here we learn, Sherabo Moser Lo Shivcha Kananis, that the master can give him a Canaanite slave. So in what way do you work him at night? So not that he's working as a laborer, but he can produce children. That you're allowed to marry him to a Shivcha Kananis, a Canaanite slave, to produce children. That's what he meant. So the Tanakama is saying, that's how I know that the master can marry him against his will to a Shivcha Kananis, to a Canaanite slave, and therefore I don't use the word lo to teach me that. Rabbi Lazar said, lo teaches me bal karcho. You give it to him, give him a wife, against his will. Rabbi Lazar says, no, the Tanakama says, no, I have a different verse to teach me that. And therefore lo is extra to teach me, in this case, the master can give him a wife, but not in the case where he sells himself. Ve'idach, and Rabbi Lazar will respond, Ime hasam, if I was just learning from there, this idea of double the work, and he works at night, and that's talking about producing children with a Shivcha Kananis, with a Canaanite slave, if I was trying to learn from there, Hava Mina, Hagimili Midaite, if I was just reading that, I would say that it means with his agreement. I wouldn't necessarily know that you could even do it against his will. Aval bal karcho emalo, but against his will, maybe not. Maybe the master does not have that right. Kamash malam, that's why the word lo teaches me that even against his will. And the word lo is not extra, and therefore Rabbi Lazar says lo is coming to teach me against his will, that you can marry him a Shivcha Kananis against his will, and it's not excluding anything, and therefore the Gezerah Shava of Sacher stands or is still in effect, and we compare the one who based and sells to the one who sells himself, and both of them he's allowed to marry to a Shivcha Kananis. That's according to Rabbi Lazar. And according to the first opinion, no, the first opinion said that the word lo is not for that. The word lo is to teach me that here, in the case where Beis Din sells him, that's where he can be married to a Shivcha Kananis, but not in the case where he sells himself. Okay, so at this point, the Gemara is now going to say, fine, so we explained that Brisa, and we explained what they're arguing about, but we also explained that they both agree that there is a Gezerah Shava of Sacher. That we do compare the one who sells himself to the one who Beis Din sells using that Gezerah Shava. So who was the opinion that the Gemara alluded to earlier that doesn't hold of the Gezerah Shava? So the Gemara asks, Ela man Tana de lo yalav Sacher. So who is the Tana that doesn't learn this Gezerah Shava of Sacher? Hi Tana, who it's the following Tana. De Tanya, because we're learning a Brisa. Bishavel mishpachto v'gomer. The verse speaks about that the slave goes out at the Jubilee year, at the Yovel year. So who is that verse speaking about? So Amar Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov. Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov said, B'ma kasav medaber. What is this verse speaking about? Iba mocher atzmo. If it's talking about where he sells himself, Harei kvar amar. We already have a verse that teaches me that he goes out at Yovel in that context. Over there, a little earlier, it said, Ad shnas Yovel yavod imach, that he'll work for you until Yovel. So there's a very clear, explicit verse in the context of selling himself that he goes out at Yovel. And Ibn Nirtza, if it's talking about where he already had his ear pierced, Harei Kvar Amar, that we also already have a verse that teaches me that he goes out at Yovel. That the Gemara is going to have to show us what the verse is in a little bit, but the Gemara for now says there is a verse already that teaches me that. So what is this pasuk coming to teach me when it says he goes out at Yovel? I already know he goes out at Yovel when he sells himself. I already know he goes out at Yovel when he tries to extend his stay, or he does extend his stay, through getting his ear pierced. It must be talking about when Beis Din sold him. And Shtayim Rishal Shonim with Yovel, and even 2 or 3 years before Yovel, Shayovel Motzio, and it's teaching me that he goes out. Meaning, because if it was talking about more than 6 years, we already have a verse for that, because that means he's a Nirtza. There's a verse that teaches me that a Nirtza, when his ear pierced, goes out at Yovel. So it must be talking about before that point. Beis Din sold him. It's within, it says 2 or 3, it could really be 5 or 6, but it's less than 6, or really, it's less than 6. 6 years have not passed yet. So he goes out at Yovel. And if it was true that this Tana held of the Gezerah Shava of Sacher, that anything it says by when he sells himself is true when Beis Din sells him. Anything that's true when Beis Din sells him is true when he sells himself. Why do I need this verse? Just use the Gezerah Shava. Because we have a verse that says it when he sells himself, he goes out at Yovel. So we could say, and we learn from there, that so too when Beis Din sells him. If you hold of the Gezerah Shava, if you hold to compare them. This Tana, who needed another pasuk, must not hold of the Gezerah Shava. Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, or Nachman Bar Yitzchak responds, Le'olam Yalev Sacher. No, really, it could be he holds of the Gezerah Shava. But yet I still need the extra pasuk, the second time. I need it to be repeated, because I would have thought that you don't apply the Gezerah Shava and learn one from the other in this instance. I might have thought to say Mocher Atzmo, who, when he sells himself, he goes out at Yovel, Delo Avad Isura. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't steal or anything. He just was poor and he sold himself. Aval Machruhu Beis Din. But when Beis Din sells him because he stole to Avad Isura, where he did something wrong, Ema Niknase. I might have thought we should give him a kanas, we should give him a fine, and it's worse, and say you don't go out at Yovel. You gotta complete at least 6 years, I guess. Kamash Malan. That's why we have a special verse to teach me that. So even though he holds of the Gezerah Shava, you might have thought that this is different. You might have thought that only when he sells himself, he didn't do any Aveira, he didn't steal. That's where we say, whichever comes first, 6 years or Yovel. You go out at Yovel. But if you stole, then you get a kanas, I might have said. You get a fine, and we say you don't go out at Yovel if it's less than 6 years. You gotta do your time. You gotta fill the 6 years. Kamash Malan. That's why the extra verse comes and says no. Even here, you could go out at Yovel. Okay, now we have to examine, as I mentioned earlier, the Brisa said that we already have a verse by a Nirtza, by someone whose ear is pierced, who stayed beyond the 6 years, that they go out at Yovel. So the Gemara now quotes that part of the Brisa. It says, Amar Mar, the master said, Ibn Irtza Harei Kvar Amar. If the verse was talking about a Nirtza, the one who had his ear pierced, that he goes out at Yovel, well, we already have a verse for that. So Maihi, the Gemara says, what is that verse? Where do we have a verse for that? Tanya, because the Brisa says, the pasuk says, the verse says, V'shavtem ish al achuzaso v'ish al mishpachto. That at Yovel, each man will return to his land and to his family. The Gomer and so on. Bima kasav medaber. What is this verse where it talks about them returning? What is this verse about? Iba mocher atzmo. If it's talking about where he sold himself, harei kvar amar. We already have a pasuk, as we mentioned earlier. We have an explicit pasuk when he sells himself, he goes there at Yovel. Iba mocheru Beis Din. If it's talking about where Beis Din sold him, well, we just did that, right? We just showed that we have a pasuk for that too. Harei kvar amar. We already have a pasuk for that. That was Vishavel Mishpachto. That was what we just learned. So, it must be talking about a Nirtza, someone who had his ear pierced, and It's shtayim v'shalosh shanim lifnei hayovel, and it's just 2 or 3 years before the yovel. And it's teaching me shayovel motzia, and it's teaching me that he goes out at yovel. My mashma. Now, why is it implied that this is who it's talking about in this verse? Where do we see in the words of the verse that it's talking about a nirtza, one who had his ear pierced? So Amar Rava Bar Shila, Amar Kra, because the verse says ish. It says ish so each man returns to his land. Davar shnoig be'ish being noig be'isha. It must be talking about someone it must be in the context of something that's relevant to a man and not to a woman. And what is that? Havayomer Zuritzia must be because it's talking about the one who got his ear pierced. Because we already established earlier that there's no concept of piercing the ear and having her stay on longer for a female slave, a maidservant. It's only true by a male, and therefore it makes sense that this pasuk is talking about, because it says ish, it says a man. It makes sense it's talking about the one who had his ear pierced. And it's teaching me that if he decides to stay on longer. So he was a slave for 6 years. He didn't want to go free. So he says, I want to stay. He gets his ear pierced. But then when Yovel comes again, even if it's only 2 or 3 years, not again, but when Yovel comes, he goes free. Now explains the Gemara, I need both a pasuk for the case where based in Salzim, and it's within the 6 years that the Yovel comes, and I need a pasuk that for after those 6 years that he goes free. I need to know that Yovel sets him free before the 6 years, when based in Salzim, and I need a pasuk that Yovel sets him free after the 6 years. Why? Why can't I learn one from the other? If the Torah had only taught us that when based in Salzim, and less than 6 years have elapsed, that Yovel still sets him free, I would say mishum delo mate zmane. That's because the 6 years aren't up yet. He never decided to stay on, which is kind of frowned upon. So we say Yovel sets you free. Aval nirtza, but someone who had his ear pierced, his 6 years came. He had his chance to go free. Ema niknasei. We might say that he decided to stay on, which the Torah frowns upon because Hashem is our master, and we don't want a human master. So he did something wrong. So you might say, that's it. You did something wrong, you can't go free anymore. That's why the Torah has to specifically teach me that even after the 6 years, when Yovel comes, he goes free. V'yashmeina nirtza, and if it had only taught me the case of nirtza, the case where he gets his ear pierced, that after the 6 years, when he stays on, when Yovel comes, he goes free, I would say, mishum da'avad le sheish. I would say that that's where he already served 6 years. So once you serve 6 years, then Yovel will set you free if you decide to stay on longer. Aval machruhu based in, but in the case where based in Salzim, it's within the first 6 years, she hasn't even done 6 years yet. Eimalo, I might say that Yovel can't set him free early. He has to do at least 6 years. Tzricha. So I need a separate verse to teach me that even within the first 6 years, he never served 6 years, still Yovel sets him free. Now there's within the verses that discuss him going free, there's kind of almost a contradiction, because it says by the nirtza, when he gets his ear pierced, it says after that va'avado li'olam, he'll serve his master forever, it sounds like. But then we also have this pasuk that says that he goes out at Yovel, v'shavtem yishalach uzaso, he goes out at Yovel, so he's not serving forever. So we learned that it doesn't really mean forever, it means forever up until Yovel, basically. But why do we even need that? Why do we need that? Just leave it out. So why do we need both of these things? So we need both. De'ikas of Rachmana li'olam, if it had said that he serves forever, havamino li'olamash, I might have thought that he serves the rest of his life and he doesn't go out at Yovel. That's right, pretty obvious. So Kasa Rachmana v'shavtem. That's why the Torah had to say, no, you return, and they should return. They go free at Yovel, even though it says li'olam. Even though it says forever, it's not true. It means until Yovel. V'i Kasa Rachmana v'shavtem. But if they only said they shall return at Yovel, and it never says this and that he serves li'olam forever, Hava Amina, I might have said, Hani mili hecha delo avad sheish. That's only true where he didn't serve 6 years. Aval heicha da'avad sheish. But if he already, meaning that which we wait till, that which he goes out at Yovel, is only if Yovel comes before 6 years. But heicha da'avad sheish, but if he worked 6 years, I would think that he goes free after those 6 years. This is the second set of 6 years. So I might have said that a guy works for 6 years. He says, I want to stay. So then how long does he work? So I might say he works till Yovel, if it's less than 6 years, or whichever comes first, Yovel or 6 years. And even the second set of 6, he goes out after the second set of 6, after 12, I might have said. Then lo yesofa chamer mitchilaso. That the end shouldn't be more stringent than the beginning. That matchilaso sheish, just like originally he had a term of 6 years, af sofa nami sheish. I would say that also at the end, he also has a term of 6 years. That if a guy decides to stay on and get his ear pierced, I might have thought, and let's say Yovel's not for another 20 years, I might have thought, well, he could go free after 6, just like he had the option to go free after the first 6. That's what I might have thought to say. Kamash malan, that's why I need the word le'olam. Kamash malan le'olam, le'olamo shel Yovel, that it's like forever till Yovel. That we don't say that when it comes to a nirtza, once he decides to have his ear pierced and to stay on, Pasuk says, V'avodo le'olam, he serves forever. What do we mean by forever? We mean that you don't just go free after 6, you have to wait till Yovel. Now Yovel might be just 2 years later, it might be 3, but it could also be 25. And it could be that you'll end up serving another 25 years, but that's what the Torah is teaching me. V'shavtem, and you return, but also V'avodo le'olam, you serve forever, you don't go free until Yovel comes around. Okay, we'll hold there. Pick up next time.